Hello everyone, and welcome to this Oxford Centre for Life Writing event on life writing, poetry and being an incoherent bystander. I'm delighted to welcome the poet Heidi Williamson to our virtual Life Writing Centre today. Heidi's poetry has appeared in literary journals in the UK, America and Australia and been translated into Polish, German and Turkish. Her work has inspired poetry and science discussions in schools and has featured in NHS waiting rooms, cafes, and at science and literary festivals in the UK and abroad. Her first collection, Electric Shadow, was a Poetry Book Society recommendation and shortlisted for the Seamus Heaney Prize for Poetry. Her second, The Print Museum, won the East Anglian Book Award for Poetry. In 1996, Heidi lived in Dunblane, the community that suffered an inconceivable tragedy in the primary school shooting. Through poems about landscape and loss, her third collection, Return by Minor Road, published by Bloodaxe, explores the lasting impact of being an incoherent bystander at such a tragedy. Welcome, Heidi, and thanks for taking the time to talk to us about your work. I've got some questions for you, and as part of your answers, I think you're going to read some poems to us that explain the kind of issues that we're talking about. So really looking forward to both those types of answers. So I'm going to begin by asking you a question about why poetry. Now, how might writing a collection of poetry in response to a significant and traumatic event like Dunblane be different from writing something like a memoir or a historical account or an essay?
That's a really good question, and thank you very much for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be able to talk to you about the book today. I think primarily I'm a poet, so I was, if I was going to talk about it at all, I was always going to talk about it from the point of view of poetry. But I also think that you can do really interesting things with time in a poem. In Time Lived Without Its Flow, a book that's been quite important to me, Denise Riley talks about time as being based on expectation and therefore memory. So we think about, I'll wake up tomorrow morning because we woke up this morning and we woke up the morning before. And in poems, you can set up quite interesting patterns of sound and repetition, and that sets different expectations. So you can kind of play with time. You can, and well, necessarily you slow down the reader at the end of the line and you make them pause. And poems have to be read generally quite slowly and with attention. You have to focus and you have to think about every word and weigh it against the experience. But also you can put a lot of space in a poem. You can slow down time and you can kind of cram words together and speed up time and make it relentless. And you can also use repetition to circle around something. And in a poem like Fugitive Dust, I kind of use repetition and incantation to talk about a moment which is sort of suspended in time, those moments that you carry with you, but also they're in the past, they've gone, but they're still present in your everyday. So I can read Fugitive Dust to you now. Fugitive Dust. Child in the doorway who appears and disappears around the edge of my open book. How do you find me? The landing light stutters in your presence. The pale carpet shifts and shapes around your boneless toes. Child in the doorway who appears each evening without footsteps. I can hear you breathing. Still as a frame, you hold yourself up softly. Your clothes resist sight. Child in the doorway who appears, a creature or chrysalis, of fugitive dust. Your presence fills my mouth with the tang of blood. I daren't move or swallow, for fear you might withdraw. Child in the doorway who appears, when the scent of wood smoke drifts onto the duvet, cautious as mist. Will you never step forwards?
Thank you. I mean, that is such a powerful poem, so many layers in it, of memory and time and repetition. And speaking of memory, I mean, that one sounds a little bit like you're being haunted by a memory or memories. Can you tell us a little bit about how you assembled the details that you based the collection on? I mean, was it primarily based on your memories, or did you consult other sources of information when you were writing the poems and assembling the collection?
Well, it was never anything I particularly wanted to write about or that I spoke about to people. I lived in Dunblane, for on and off for about 11 years, and many of my friends wouldn't have known that I'd lived there. When we first moved there, nobody really knew about the place, and we used to have to say it was halfway between Edinburgh and Glasgow when we were saying where we lived. And then the tragedy happened in 1996, and if you mentioned the place to people, it had such a weight to it. It became something that you sort of had to have a conversation about, and I didn't necessarily want to do that. So I never particularly wanted to start writing about it, but I kind of reached a point in my life where it became very present in my life. My son was the same age as the children who were killed, and it just started bringing up lots of memories for me. So I thought I was writing about other things. And then I sort of ended up writing little fragments about that particular time. So I didn't deliberately set out to write about it, but it became something that I needed to look at and needed to write about. So I initially followed just my memories and my thoughts and started to write just little phrases and fragments. The two longer poems in the book, Cold Spring 1 and Cold Spring 2, were initially just little bits of phrases and words that I ended up weaving together into the sort of central narrative. So I sort of followed my memory initially. And then when I realized that it was something that was going to be a book and it was going to be a collection of poems, I did do some reading, some factual reading. So I read memoirs from survivors and family members. I watched documentaries. I read the Cullen Report, just to check that I hadn't got any of my facts wrong, because I thought that would be immensely disrespectful to just misremember something as we do and then put it down on paper and it to be wrong. But I couldn't put any of those facts in the poems. They were too hard, too raw. Anne Carson in Knox talks about history as being both factual and incomprehensible. And the facts, I couldn't carry them in the poems. So that's when I decided that I was going to do prefaces to each of the sections that had details and facts in, so that people who read the collection, who maybe, younger people today, they don't know what happens, they don't know it as a historic event, so that the information was there to help the reader, but the poems carried the emotional weight of what it was that I wanted to look at. So yes, I did do research later on in the process.
Did the research change any of the sort of creative writing that you did?
A little bit. It brought out things that were instinctive for me, that I realised were instinctive and not necessarily obvious to everybody. So I wrote a lot about the river and a river, and the idea of, river of time, I guess, is quite common. But it took me quite a while before I realised that Dunblane's the only place I lived that has a river in it, and we used to walk quite often by the river, and it was a big part of the place for me. So it was when I was looking at the factual information, I wanted to bring out a little bit about what the town was known for in more distant past. And it was known for the river and the beauty of the place. And I suddenly thought, oh my goodness, that's why I keep writing about the river. So it was quite informative for me looking at the factual things in a way.
I mean, and you talked about the order in which you did things. So you began with your memories, almost a sort of, you didn't realize that was what you were writing about until you saw what you had written, and then afterwards you went to the facts. And it sounds like the facts affected the structure of the collection, how you assembled it and how you ordered it with the prefaces to the sections. Could you talk a little bit more about how you organized it? Was it like a normal, typical piece of life writing where you begin in childhood and proceed from there, or was it organised in a different way?
The structure emerged over time. When I started writing about it, it was very fragmented and very raw, and it took me a long time to kind of approach it. And I realised quite early on that I couldn't begin the book there. It was too much, either for me or for anybody, just opening this book and starting to read. So I took a deliberate decision to start in the very recent past when I was writing a couple of years ago, and look at why I was thinking about this now, why it was important to me now. And there were some major shootings in the US, so it was coming up quite a lot in my thoughts at the time as well. And as I said, my son was at the same age. So the poems at the beginning of the book look at that and how this memory starts to come back and how it resonates over the years. And then the middle section goes back to the day and the events of the day and what happened. And then the third section moves back towards the present again, how you carry these things with you into the future. So I started to think about it as a sort of three-part structure with the central event, the tragedy in the middle. And that seemed a pretty balanced way to carry it. And also it was something that I could approach, and I thought maybe it would be gentler on a reader as well.
So almost in sense of it records the process of you thinking about it.
Yes.
Recognizing that you wanted to think about it after not wanting to think about it, and then thinking about it, and then coming to terms with having thought about it.
Yeah, totally. And there was another book that was important to me was Rebecca Stott's memoir, In the Days of Rain, where she talks about growing up in a cult. And it took her a long time to write about that. She's a very successful novelist. She teaches, she's got this great writing career, but it took her a long time to look at that subject for her. And there's a bit at the beginning of the book where she talks about, why am I talking about this now? And also she says, anybody else's experience of this, major historical thing, this cult, would be different. All I'm laying down is my own personal experience of it, and it's necessarily partial, and different people would have different things to bring and different things to say. And I really appreciated how she placed herself in the book and said, this is why now, and this is why me, and anybody else might have a completely different view, and that's fine. And I found that really helpful.
So writing, life writing can be an emotional experience for the writer.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean that kind of brings me to another question that I was really fascinated by reading and rereading your book, which is also a theme that we have been visiting and revisiting this term, which is the theme of silence in life writing. And poetry, I guess, is normally thought of as a kind of staging of language. It's meant to be read aloud, it's meant to be performed, but it also, as you touched on at the beginning, it contains silences, pauses, the spaces on the page that poetic form creates. I mean, could you say a little bit more about silences in this collection?
Silence is really important in the collection. Absence is at the heart of the book. The lives that were lost, the lives that never come to be, because those children should be 30 now with families. The loss and the absences in the town, all those kinds of things. So absence is at the heart of the book, and silence is also at the heart of the book. And the fragmented poems that I talked about, like Cold Spring, they're made up as much of hesitations and negations and silences and blocks as they are of words. The silences are very important. And the Erasure poems as well were a deliberate choice. So to take some important words and take important things away from them and render them as silence instead. There's a poem of my own in the book, which I did an erasure on. I don't think I've seen anyone do that before. I mean, there might be examples, but I've always carried this with me as something that's formed me as a person, and it has been in my writing, but in such a disguised way that only really I knew. And so I took a poem from my first book, The Woodcutter, which for me has always been about, the tragic events in Dunblane, and took away some of the peripheries so that structure became very clear. There's another poem in the first book called Arachne that begins, "You tell me your dream of the dead children." And obviously for me, I knew what that was about, and my husband knew what that was about, but it was coached in myth and kind of wrapped up in a way that at the time I could sort of handle. The other Erasure poem that was important to me in the book is an Erasure of Let Us Describe by Gertrude Stein. And Stein is a writer that I admire immensely for her investigations into what language can do and can't do, where it stops and where it falters. And Let Us Describe is, particularly for Stein, a relatively straightforward prose poem about an evening and a party until the end, where it sort of leapfrogs over something that happened and then just completely breaks down into what almost seems like nonsense. But actually it's a poem about an accident and possibly a death. And in Let Us Describe, what she's doing is showing how it's impossible to render that moment, how it's just, it's too fragmented to even be thought about. I took Let Us Describe and I took even more away from it. So it was just these few bare words on the page. And I've called it Describe because it's the inability to describe, it's the inability to say. So I could read the Erasure poems for you, if you like.
That would be great. And also I was thinking that some of the Life Writing Centre audience might not know exactly what you mean by an Erasure poem. So could you just say a little bit about what that is and why a poet might choose that form?
So an Erasure poem is where you take a body of words and you deliberately redact or remove elements of it. So if you think about censorship, for example, where words are blocked out either because they're very important or because when you block them out, it gives a different message. And poets use erasure in different ways. So someone like Raymond Antrobus, who took Ted Hughes's poem about the deaf school, which is actually awful and very derogatory about people who can't hear. Raymond Antrobus took that poem and basically put a line through every single line of that poem. And by doing that, he was making a statement that not only does this poem need to be crossed out, it needs to be seen to be crossed out. So in Erasure poems, you can put a line through something, keep it present, but make sure that people know it's been removed. Or you can actually take words out so there are gaps where there didn't used to be gaps. I've also seen people use square brackets to imply that something should be here, but it's not there. Anne Carson, when she does her Sappho fragment, so Sappho was a fantastic ancient female poet, and her poems have come down to us kind of broken and fragmented over time. If you sort of imagine they've been left out in the rain for 50 years, there's only little fragments of her original poems, but the fragments themselves are so beautiful and tell their own story. And in them, Anne Carson uses square brackets to suggest kind of the passing of time and what's left out. So Erasure poems can be quite unusual, but they can also be immensely powerful in using the silence in a poem to give a message as much as the words.
Thank you.
In a schoolroom, the woodcutter had come for the children. Every wolf that he could muster, herded them into the darkened forest. They tried to be small as birds, quieter, one feather pressed to their beaks. The woodcutter called to them with his shiny voice. The children lay their heads beneath their wings and waited.
Hugely powerful. I love when you read that, you leave the spaces as pauses, as silences.
Well, Glyn Maxwell says that poets work with two materials, one's black, one's white. And I think the main difference for me between poetry and prose is that intentional use of the white space and the silence. Like a musician, you place the silences as carefully as you would place the words. Describe is even barer. I mean, if I show it to you on the page, there's only a few words there at all. So I'll read that one for you, and then describe. It was larger, unable, sacrifice, a village, a ruin. And that's the whole poem.
And how does that interact with what we were saying before about memories and being ready to write about something and research, reading documents and looking at photographs? How does a poem like that, that's so sparse, relate to those ideas that we were talking about?
I think poems are very, very condensed. So it takes the experience, and for me, it takes key moments and key places and key thoughts, and tries to find a way to frame them or shape them, and then look at how they might kind of speak to each other across the collection. So I was very conscious in putting the collection together that there's almost a narrative arc. There's kind of starting now, going back, and then bringing yourself back to the present day.
And you mentioned place. I mean, obviously, place is such a huge part of this collection. Earlier, you talked about the river, but could you say a little bit more about the relationship that you see between place and landscape and the natural world and memories and life writing in your work?
In describing the collection, Esther Morgan talks about the landscape cut into the heart. And I think that's a really beautiful way of talking about what's happening in the book for me. I loved living in Scotland, and it was so beautiful. And there's a quote in one of the poems, The Weight of News, where I talk about that silent carousel of landscapes and faces I roll out in times of need. And I can close my eyes and I can be on a motorbike bumping over a road in the Trossachs, by Lochs, or I can be standing on top of Demyat looking across at distant hills, or I can be in our small flat and looking out across the rose garden and the golf course and the Trossachs. So it was a place of immense beauty and home for me. And I wanted that in the book too. I wanted that warmth and that love for the place. And I deliberately put place names in it that I love and my husband loves, and they became almost talismanic. So titles like, Sheriff Muir, Balquhidder, Loch Earn. There were more. There were so many more that I wrote. I wrote about Loch Katrine and lots of other places, but the poems didn't always make the book. But the landscape there is immensely important to me and very beautiful. And the ordinariness of it and the dailiness of it, I wanted to bring back as well. So we were talking about how perhaps a place becomes known for one thing. I mean, times moved on, and, wonderfully, Dunblane is also now known for Andrew Murray and the Golden Post Box and all those kind of things. But for me, it's always a place of great beauty and ordinariness and dailiness. And in some of the poems, I tried to bring that out as well. So I could read a few of those for you now, if you like.
Please do, yeah.
So this is a poem about going back. We go back regularly to visit Dunblane, visit friends there, and kind of go back over our old haunts. And it's interesting to me how what we notice about a place varies over time. And I was very conscious of the use of the place name Dunblane, because a lot of people now it's just an ordinary place name, which is terrific. But people who were around when the tragedy happened, as soon as you say the word, it's like other places where terrible things have happened. It just becomes associated with that. So I was very careful about how and when I used the word Dunblane in the book. And I used it as a title for a poem just about going back with my family and having a lovely ordinary day, because for me, that's also what the place is about. Dunblane. Walking the hill to our old flat, the pubs and benches we used to visit accumulate behind us. The golf club rests greenly in its aisle. The old new Tesco seems emptier now. We discover play parks, museums, heritage sites that as students we never deign to find. We watch the future we dare not presume run ahead towards the climbing frames, the swirled slide that delivers him lightly onto the earth. Historical markers. These gold-edged squares of interest and importance, set in the sides of buildings, the bridge, these plaques are solid as teeth, surprising in crumbling stone. In what seems like a moment, they become odd as a house, seen from the garden first thing, when the mist clears and a window hosts a disembodied torso turning on taps and boiling a kettle. The chinks of cups, clicks of appliances, and native bark of a winter cough surprise the grass and its inhabitants. The gold-edged eye of a blackbird commemorates this. Like a blackbird, I like to sing after rain. Like a blackbird, there is no sign I can add to my body to state its past more accurately than my body. The weight of news. I had lost not only a place, but the past that goes with it, the clues from which to construct a present self, even Boland, object lessons. Until I walked this road again, I would have sworn it was steeper, that the houses were set back more deeply behind walls. I thought there was more foliage, more cover. Perhaps the trees have grown, as I have not, new leaves extending out of reach. My body recalls slowly hiking this hill, backpack brimming with shopping, heading home. I reach the small crossroads of the drive. Birds like debris rise from the branches. Blue-grey clouds mark the mid-morning sky. Years ago, news arrived abruptly here. It lingers inexplicable in the presence of everything I see. If I close my eyes, I can make this place again, the small, silent carousel of landscapes and faces I roll out in times of need. Still for a moment, I imagine it back. The casual beauty returns to the pavement. Moss fuzzes the stone lines, greening their grey. I open my eyes and step intently ahead, in and out of the shadows, letting the past back in, just as it was.
So evocative, and also, I mean, while you were reading that last poem, I was thinking about the way that you say, and news arrives, and I wanted to ask you, it reminded me of the way that you, I think it's you that's used the word incoherent bystander, rather than someone else using it about you. And I wondered if you could say a little bit more about what that means to you, or being sort of I think you've described it as being on the edge of the tragedy rather than central to it.
Yes, Incoherent Bystander is in one of the Cold Spring poems, and I was so conscious when writing about this subject not to claim too much. I had my experience of it just on the peripheries, just on the edges. I didn't have children. I had friends and colleagues whose children were shot. I used to work as a cleaner when I was at university, and I'd never met them, but I'd regularly cleaned the bedrooms of a couple of the children. But I was very much on the edges of what happened, just part of the community, definitely not anybody that was centrally involved at all. And I worried about that a lot. I worried about writing that experience from the edges and whether that had value, whether it was possible to do that. And I guess whenever there's a major tragedy on the news, I think immediately, obviously, of the victims and those most closely involved. But I also think about everyone who knew those people, knew that place, were there the week before, were due to go there the week after. Maybe they grew up there and they've moved away. All the lives that it affects and impacts and how it ripples down over the years. So I guess that experience of being on the edges was something that I wanted to honour and look at as well. So many of us have so many events in our lives that we weren't in the centre of, but they do impact us. And in a poem like And, I guess I wanted to bring in how widely these events affect the community, people on the edges, and how even that can really have significant impact on people's lives going forwards. And the postman, and the florist, and the dentist, and the bus driver, and the sports coach, and the music tutor, and the friends, and the cousins, and the babysitter, and the creche, and the train driver, and the road sweeper, and the bin men, and the window cleaner, and the windscreen replacement team, and the boiler repairman, and the carpet fitter, and the pizza delivery guy, and the neighbours, and the street across, and the town, and the county, and the island, and the continent, and the planet, and in space, and the stars, and the hairdresser, and the doctor, and the nurse, and the surgeon, and the paramedic, and the toy shop, and the sweet shop, and the cinema, and the newsagents, and the cafe, and the bar, and the pub, and the park, and the river, and the bridge, and the soil, and the wind, and the sunshine, and the rain, and the flowers, and the buildings, and the motorways, and the petrol station, and the supermarket, and the church, and the cathedral, and the library, and the roundabout, and the flags, and the bunting, and the pie shop, and the bakery, and the museum, and the walks, and the pathways, and the berries, and the birds, and the pets, and the vets, and the garage, and the cleaners, and the kitchen fitter, and the co-workers, and the corporation, and the stock market, and the royals, and the politicians, and the laws, and the procedures, and the neurons, and the possibilities, and the eventualities, and the next time, and the grandparents, and the teacher, and the classmates, and the siblings, and the parents, and the children, and...
Well, thank you so much, Heidi, for joining us. I think that seems like a suitable place to end. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure talking to you.